History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Picture yourself standing at the port of Athens in the sweltering summer heat of 415 BC. The air practically crackles with electricity. Every single Athenian has flooded down to the docks at Piraeus, their faces a strange cocktail of wild hope and streaming tears. Stretched out before you is the most jaw-dropping armada ever assembled by a Greek city. 134 warships called triremes, their bronze rams catching the morning sun like liquid gold, their sails impossibly bright against the deep blue Aegean. On their decks stand thousands of soldiers, the absolute pride of Athens' youth, armor polished to a mirror shine. This isn't just a military operation. It's pure theater, a display of wealth, power, and raw ambition so overwhelming it feels like watching a thunderstorm roll in. A trumpet blast cuts through the noise, demanding silence. A herald's voice rises up, and the entire fleet, together with the massive crowd on shore, lifts prayers to the gods. Golden and silver goblets catch the light as libations pour out, and a hymn rises toward the heavens. Then the oars begin their rhythmic dance, and the ships glide out, first in a dignified column, but then, as if they simply can't contain their energy, they burst into a race toward the horizon. Where are they going? Sicily, a distant island whispered to be drowning in riches and ripe cities ready for conquest. The soldiers are drunk on dreams of glory. The people on shore weep for sons they might never hold again, but even their grief carries a thread of fierce pride. They're Athenians, after all. In their minds, nothing is impossible. Here's the gut punch, though. This glorious morning marks the beginning of the end. This magnificent fleet, this army that embodies everything powerful about Athens, will never come home. Nearly every single man will die thousands of miles away in a disaster so complete, so utterly catastrophic, that it will shatter their empire and reverberate through history forever. The man documenting this story wasn't some detached academic scribbling notes centuries later. His name was Thucydides, and he was an Athenian general who lived through every brutal moment. He fought in the war, suffered the bitter taste of exile because of it, and then spent the rest of his life wrestling with one terrifying question. How could a people so brilliant, so powerful, so supremely confident, engineer their own destruction? His book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, has been devoured for over 2,000 years, not by dusty professors, but by generals, presidents, and leaders, navigating the dangerous waters of power. Why? Because Thucydides did something revolutionary. He stripped away the myths, ignored the convenient excuses about angry gods, cut through all the propaganda, and saw clearly that war is fundamentally a story about human nature. It's about fear, pride, and hunger, about how smart people make catastrophic decisions, about how empires climb to dizzying heights only to collapse under their own weight. Today, we're going to walk through that story together, and I guarantee you, by the time we're done, you'll see that this isn't just ancient history gathering dust. It's about the world right now. This is a timeless masterclass on power, conflict, and the unchanging, often heartbreaking nature of humanity itself. Our story opens in a world dominated by two superpowers that couldn't be more different. First, you've got Sparta. Imagine a nation of hardcore warriors living a brutally disciplined, no-frills existence on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. The Spartans are absolutely unstoppable on land. Their entire society is basically one giant military machine, built on tradition, obedience, and a deep distrust of anything remotely new. They lead the Peloponnesian League, a coalition of land-based states with oligarchic governments that look to Sparta for muscle and direction. On the flip side, you've got Athens, a city practically vibrating with energy, art, and radical ideas that would make traditionalists clutch their pearls. Athens is a democracy, a naval superpower, a bustling commercial hub. Its people are curious, innovative, bold, and let's be honest, often reckless. After their epic victory against the Persian Empire, Athens created the Delian League. It started as a friendly alliance to guard against future Persian threats, but over time Athens basically transformed it into their personal empire, demanding tribute and crushing anyone who tried to leave. For decades, these two titans coexisted in a tense standoff, like two boxers circling each other. But as Athens grew richer and flexed its muscles more, a deep anxiety started spreading through Sparta and its allies like wildfire. Thucydides puts his finger precisely on the war's most important cause, and it's a lesson studied ever since. He writes that the real trigger was the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon. Sparta feared that Athens's meteoric rise would eventually squeeze out any room for its own existence. This is the heart of what we now call the Thucydides trap, that dangerous moment when a rising power threatens to displace the established ruler. The war didn't kick off with dramatic declarations. It started, as great wars often do, with trouble in a small, seemingly insignificant corner of the world. Civil war erupted in a city called Epidamnus. This sparked a fight between two secondary powers, Corinth, a key Spartan ally, and Corcyra, a naval power with loose ties to Athens. Each side went crying to the big players. Corinth begged Sparta to rein in those meddling Athenians. Corcyra, desperate and cornered, ran to Athens and basically said, "Look, we'll give you our powerful navy if you protect us." The debate in Athens was absolutely fierce. Accepting Corcyra's offer meant direct confrontation with Sparta's ally Corinth, which would almost certainly trigger war. Refusing meant watching Corcyra's navy potentially fall into enemy hands. In the end, Athens chose what looked like self-interest. They made a defensive alliance with Corcyra. It was supposed to be a careful half-measure to avoid provoking Corinth directly, but it backfired spectacularly. A naval battle exploded, and Athenian ships got dragged into the fighting. The line had been crossed. The Corinthians were absolutely furious. They marched to Sparta and, in a great gathering of the Peloponnesian allies, made their case for war. They painted a vivid portrait of their rivals. The Athenians, they said, were born into the world to take no rest themselves and to give none to others. They're innovators, lightning quick to act, daring beyond any reasonable measure, and never, ever satisfied. You Spartans, by contrast, are slow, cautious, always hesitating. If you don't stop them right now, they'll devour everything. After heated debate, Sparta sent an ultimatum to Athens. Their demands were numerous, but the final one was elegantly simple: leave the Hellenes independent. For Athens, this was impossible to accept. It meant surrendering their empire, the very foundation of their power and wealth. In Athens, the great statesman Pericles stood before the packed assembly. He was the city's leading voice, a man radiating wisdom and foresight. He urged them not to bend. He laid out a crystal-clear strategy for the coming conflict. The Spartans, he argued, are a land power. Let them invade Attica, our countryside. They can burn our farms all they want, but they can't touch our true source of strength. We'll abandon the countryside, bring our people inside the long walls connecting the city to its port, and turn Athens into an island fortress. From this stronghold, our navy will dominate the sea, strangling their trade and raiding their coasts. We won't try expanding our empire during this war, but we'll defend what we have like our lives depend on it. This will be a war of attrition. We've got more money, we've got the superior navy, and we've got the defensive advantage. If we stay patient and united, we absolutely cannot lose. Convinced by his logic, the Athenians rejected the Spartan ultimatum. The war was on. Just as Pericles predicted, the Spartan army, the most fearsome land force in all of Greece, invaded Attica. The Athenians watched from their walls as smoke rose from their burning farms and ancestral homes. The city was packed, tense, angry. Many screamed for Pericles to lead them out to fight, to defend their land with honor. But he held absolutely firm. He knew a head-on battle against the legendary Spartan phalanx was suicide. Their strength was on the water. Then something happened that not even the wise Pericles could have anticipated. In the war's second year, a plague erupted in the overcrowded city. It was absolutely terrifying. Thucydides, who caught it himself and barely survived, describes symptoms in horrifying detail: violent fevers burning in the head, inflamed eyes, throats turning bloody, breath becoming unnatural, violent coughing fits, and unbearable thirst. The physicians were helpless. They died faster than anyone as they tended to the sick. The plague did more than kill bodies. It shattered Athens' very soul. Thucydides tells us that law and religion lost all meaning. Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them, he writes. People watched the virtuous and the wicked dying side by side, and concluded that piety and honor were pointless exercises. They spent their money on fleeting pleasures, believing their lives and riches were things of a day. The social fabric, the respect for tradition, the very order that made Athens great, began unraveling in the face of death. Pericles himself lost both sons to the plague, yet he stood before the demoralized people one final time. He didn't offer empty comfort or false hope. He reminded them of their greatness, of the empire they'd built with their own hands, of their duty to preserve it. He told them that while their private sufferings were immense, the fate of the city towered above everything. He urged them to bear their afflictions with courage. Not long after, Pericles too succumbed to the sickness. With him died the steady hand that had guided Athens through storm after storm. The war, however, ground relentlessly on. After Pericles, new leaders emerged in Athens, men who were more aggressive, more brutal, more in tune with the city's frayed nerves and raw anger. The most prominent was Cleon, a man Thucydides bluntly describes as the most violent man at Athens. A dramatic episode unfolded at Mytilene, on the island of Lesbos. Mytilene was one of Athens' most important allies, and it had revolted. An Athenian army was dispatched, and, after a grinding siege, the Mytileneans surrendered. The Athenian assembly, whipped into a rage and spurred on by Cleon, voted to execute all adult men of Mytilene and enslave the women and children. A ship was sent to carry out the brutal decree, but overnight a change of heart swept through Athens like a cold wind. The people were horrified by the sheer cruelty of their own decision. A second assembly was hastily called. Cleon rose again to speak, arguing fiercely that mercy was dangerous weakness. An empire, he reminded them, cannot be run on sentiment. Your empire is a despotism, he said bluntly, and your subjects are disaffected conspirators, whose obedience is ensured not by your suicidal concessions, but by the superiority given you by your own strength. He was answered by a man named Diosdotus, who argued not from mercy, but from cold self-interest. He pointed out that such brutal punishment would make every future city contemplating revolt fight to the absolute bitter end, knowing surrender meant death. It would make sieges longer, costlier, and leave Athens with nothing but ruined, worthless cities. A moderate punishment, by contrast, would encourage cities to surrender quickly when they knew their cause was hopeless. The debate was fierce and close, but in the end, Diosdotus's argument narrowly won. A second ship was immediately dispatched. The crew rowed with everything they had, eating their meals of barley cakes mixed with oil and wine at their oars, sleeping only in shifts. The first ship, carrying the death sentence, wasn't in any hurry. The second ship arrived just as the Athenian commander was about to carry out the original order, saving the people of Mytilene from massacre by the slimmest of margins. The incident revealed deep cracks in the Athenian psyche, torn between the brutal necessities of empire and their own ideals. The war had its ups and downs. The Athenians captured a contingent of elite Spartan soldiers at a place called Pylos, a massive blow to Sparta's legendary prestige. In response, the Spartans sent their most brilliant general, Brasidas, on a daring campaign through northern Greece. Brasidas was the opposite of the typical Spartan stereotype. He was charismatic, eloquent, a master of diplomacy. He marched through Thrace, not just conquering with force, but persuading Athenian allies to revolt by offering them genuine freedom. He captured the vital city of Amphipolis, a huge blow to Athens, and a personal humiliation for the historian Thucydides, who was the general commanding that region and was exiled for his failure to save the city. Finally, in a battle outside Amphipolis, the two leading warhawks of each side, the Athenian Cleon and the Spartan Brasidas, were both killed. Their deaths removed the two greatest obstacles to peace. The two sides, exhausted by 10 brutal years of fighting, were ready to talk. The result was the Peace of Nicias, a truce supposedly meant to last 50 years. But it was fragile peace, built on crumbling foundations of mistrust and unresolved grievances. Neither side fully complied with the terms. Key Spartan allies like Corinth and Thebes flat out refused to sign it. The old tension simmered just beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. Into this fragile peace stepped the most dazzling, ambitious, and dangerous figure of the entire war, Alcibiades. Alcibiades was young, devastatingly handsome, fabulously wealthy, and descended from one of Athens' most noble families. He was a brilliant speaker, a gifted military strategist, and utterly without moral scruples. He saw the peace as an obstacle to his own towering ambition, and set about deliberately undermining it. He forged a new, provocative alliance with Argos, Sparta's old rival in the Peloponnese, and dragged Athens back into mainland conflicts. This unstable period culminated in one of the most chilling episodes in the entire book, the Melian Dialogue. Melos was a tiny island, a colony of Sparta that had stayed neutral in the war. Athens decided it could no longer tolerate this neutrality. They sent an armada to the island and, before attacking, sent envoys to negotiate. Thucydides presents the dialogue that followed, and it's absolutely haunting. The Melians appeal to justice, to honor, to the gods, and to hope that Sparta will come to their aid. The Athenians brush all this aside with shocking, brutal honesty. They tell the Melians this isn't a debate about right and wrong. Right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, they say coldly, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. They lay out the pitiless logic of empire. Your friendship, they explain, would signal our weakness to our other subjects. Your destruction will demonstrate our power. Hope is a comfort for the desperate, but you're not in a position to indulge in it. The gods? We believe the gods, like men, rule wherever they can. The Spartans? They won't risk their own safety for yours. Expediency and security guide them, not honor. The Melians refuse to submit. They won't, they say, deprive of freedom in a single moment a city that has been inhabited for 700 years. The Athenians respond with a chillingly calm prediction. You have staked most on, and trusted most in, the Lacedaemonians, your fortune and your hopes, and so will you be most completely deceived. The Athenians lay siege to the city. The Melians, abandoned by the gods and the Spartans, are eventually forced to surrender. The Athenians execute all the grown men they captured, sell the women and children as slaves, and send out 500 colonists to inhabit the place themselves. It's in this climate of ruthless ambition, with Athens at the absolute peak of its power and arrogance, that the fateful decision is made. Envoys arrive from the city of Egesta in Sicily, begging for help in their local war against their neighbor Selinus, who was being backed by the most powerful city in Sicily, Syracuse. The Egestians promised vast wealth to finance the war. The Athenian assembly convened. The cautious general Nicias, a respected and experienced statesman, argued passionately against the expedition. He reminded them of the enemies they still had at home, the instability of their empire, and the immense risks of opening a new war so far away. Sicily, he warned, was huge and populous. To conquer it would be a monumental undertaking, and to fail would be absolutely catastrophic. But he was opposed by Alcibiades. In a speech brimming with youthful confidence and raw ambition, Alcibiades painted a picture of glorious adventure. Sicily, he claimed, was full of disunited cities and motley crowds, ripe for the taking. Conquering it would bring Athens immense wealth and power, cementing their empire forever. "Don't be afraid," he told them. "Let's show the Peloponnesians how little we care for this peace, and let's win ourselves a brand new empire abroad." The assembly was completely captivated. The older men thought they couldn't possibly lose with such a large force. The young men were filled with longing for foreign sights and adventure. The common people dreamed of the steady pay and rich plunder to be gained. Nicias, seeing he couldn't dissuade them, tried one last desperate tactic. He decided to scare them with the sheer scale of the undertaking. He came forward again and said that if they were going to do this, they must go with overwhelming force. At least 100 galleys, more than 5,000 heavy infantry, archers, slingers, and a massive supply train. He hoped the enormous cost would make them reconsider. But it had exactly the opposite effect. The Athenians, in their state of supreme confidence, saw the massive force not as a burden, but as an absolute guarantee of success. They voted for everything Nicias asked for, and more. They fell, as Thucydides says, in love with the enterprise. And so the great fleet set sail on that glorious summer morning, the grandest expression of Athenian power, sailing directly toward its doom. The expedition began badly. When they arrived in Sicily, they discovered the Aegistians had completely tricked them. The vast wealth they'd promised was pure fantasy. They'd borrowed gold and silver cups from neighboring cities and passed them off as their own to deceive the Athenian envoys. The generals were sharply divided on what to do next. Nicias, ever cautious, wanted to make a show of force and then sail home. Alcibiades wanted to build alliances first, then attack. But before any plan could be decided, a ship arrived from Athens with stunning news. It carried orders for Alcibiades to return home immediately to stand trial. While the expedition was preparing back in Athens, a bizarre act of sacrilege had occurred. In one night, the faces of the Hermae, stone pillars, with the head of the god Hermes standing at doorways all over the city, had been mutilated. The city threw itself into a panic, seeing it as a terrible omen and sign of a conspiracy to overthrow democracy. Alcibiades, with his scandalous lifestyle and powerful enemies, was the prime suspect. Knowing that a trial in the current climate of hysteria meant a certain death sentence, Alcibiades made a fateful choice. He agreed to follow the ship back, but at the first opportunity he escaped, made his way to the Peloponnese, and offered his services to the one city that could hurt Athens most, Sparta. It was the ultimate betrayal. Alcibiades, the man who had championed the entire expedition, now stood before the Spartan assembly and laid bare all of Athens's plans and weaknesses. He told them exactly what they needed to do to win the war. First, he said, send a Spartan general to Syracuse. A real commander will organize their resistance and give them the backbone they desperately need. Second, and far more important, you must do what we Athenians have always feared most. Establish a permanent fort in Attica itself, at a place called Decelia. This will deny Athens use of their countryside year-round, cut them off from their silver mines, and slowly bleed them to death. The Spartans listened carefully, and they acted on every word of his advice. In Sicily, with Alcibiades gone, command fell to the reluctant Nicias. After some initial successes, the Athenian army laid siege to Syracuse. They began building a massive wall of circumvallation, a double wall stretching for miles, designed to seal off the city from land and sea. The Syracusans were on the brink of despair. But just as the wall was nearing completion, the Spartan general Gylippus arrived. He slipped through the Athenian lines with a small force, but his arrival was electrifying. He was the embodiment of Spartan leadership and discipline. He organized the Syracusan army, stopped completion of the Athenian wall by building a counter-wall, and began systematically turning the tide. The besiegers had become the besieged. Nicias, watching the situation deteriorate day by day, wrote a desperate letter back to Athens. He described the rotting of their ships in the harbor, the spreading sickness in the camp, the desertion of their mercenary crews, and the growing strength of the enemy. He begged them either to recall the army or to send another army just as large to save it. The Athenians, flat out refusing to accept the possibility of failure, chose the latter. They equipped a brand new fleet and army under the command of their best remaining general, Demosthenes. When Demosthenes arrived at Syracuse, he found the first army in a desperate state. He knew immediately that their only chance was a bold, decisive stroke. He devised a daring plan, a night attack to capture the high ground of Epipolae, the strategic key to Syracuse. The attack began with real success. The Athenians stormed the heights in the darkness, taking the enemy completely by surprise. But in the confusion of the night battle, with the bright moon casting deceptive shadows everywhere, chaos took hold. The Athenians, pushed back hard by a contingent of Boeotians, fell into complete disorder. Friends fought friends in the darkness. The watchword was passed to the enemy. The Pekon, the Greek war hymn, sung by Dorian allies in the Athenian army, was mistaken for the enemy's hymn, causing widespread panic. The retreat turned into a complete rout, with men tumbling down the cliffs in pitch darkness. The attack was a catastrophic failure. Demosthenes now knew with certainty the expedition was doomed. He urged Nicias to abandon the siege immediately and sail away while their navy was still superior. But Nicias, ever hesitant and deeply superstitious, refused. He still had secret contacts within the city promising betrayal, and he was terrified of facing the Athenian assembly after such a failure. Then, just as they were finally preparing to leave, a lunar eclipse occurred. Nicias, who was profoundly superstitious, took it as a terrible omen and refused to depart until they'd waited the prescribed thrice 9 days. That delay was absolutely fatal. The Syracusans, now supremely confident, used the time to block the mouth of the great harbor, trapping the entire Athenian fleet inside like fish in a barrel. The Athenians' only hope now was to fight their way out. They manned every ship they had, about 110 in all, and charged the barrier. What followed was the final, climactic battle. Thucydides describes the scene from the shore, where the entire Athenian army stood watching helplessly, their lives literally hanging on the outcome. It was a brutal, chaotic melee in the confined space of the harbor. The air was filled with the crashing of ships, the shouting of frantic commands, and the screams of the dying. The Athenian soldiers on shore swayed physically with the fortunes of the battle, crying out in agony at every loss, and cheering in desperate hope at every small success. In that one Athenian army, Thucydides writes, there was every sound to be heard at once, shrieks, cheers, we win, we lose, and all the other manifold exclamations that a great host would necessarily utter in great peril. But the Syracusans, with their reinforced prows and fighting in their home waters, were unstoppable. The Athenian fleet was utterly defeated, broken into pieces and driven ashore. Absolute panic seized the army. Their last hope was gone. Now came the final, horrifying chapter, the retreat by land. 40,000 men began a desperate march through hostile territory, hoping against hope to reach some friendly city. They were without food, without hope, and haunted by the sight of their sick and wounded comrades, whom they were forced to abandon. The Syracusan cavalry and light troops harassed them every single step of the way. The march was a week-long agony of hunger, thirst, and constant attack. Demosthenes' division, lagging behind, was surrounded and forced to surrender. Nicias' division pushed desperately on until they reached the river Asinaris. Maddened by thirst, the men broke ranks completely and rushed into the water, each wanting to be the first to drink. The Syracusans lined the steep banks above and showered them with missiles like target practice. The Peloponnesians came down into the riverbed and butchered them as they drank. The water, Thucydides tells us, was immediately spoiled, but which they went on drinking just the same, mud and all, bloody as it was, most even fighting to have it. At last, with his army being slaughtered around him, Nicias surrendered. Of the 40,000 who began the retreat, precious few escaped. The prisoners, numbering at least 7,000, were herded into the stone quarries of Syracuse. There, exposed to the burning sun by day and the cold autumn nights, with barely enough food and water to survive, they died in droves from wounds, sickness, and exposure. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed without ceremony. It was, Thucydides concludes, the greatest Hellenic achievement of any in this war, or, in my opinion, in Hellenic history, at once most glorious to the victors, and most calamitous to the conquered. They were beaten at all points, and altogether, their fleet, their army, everything was destroyed, and few out of many returned home. When the news finally reached Athens, no one at first would believe it. When the conviction was finally forced upon them, the city was seized by a panic, unlike anything before. They had lost their army, their navy, and the absolute flower of their youth. Their allies began revolting immediately, emboldened by the disaster. The Persians, seeing Athens' weakness like blood in the water, now entered the war, providing money to the Spartans to build a new fleet. Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, switched sides yet again, abandoning the Spartans to work for the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, all the while plotting his return to Athens. In the city, the shock of the disaster led directly to a political coup. The democracy was overthrown and replaced by an oligarchy, the rule of the 400. But the Athenian fleet, based at the island of Samos, refused to accept the new government. Led by men like Thrasybulus, they declared themselves the true democratic government of Athens, and, in a strange twist of fate, recalled Alcibiades to be their general. The war entered its final grinding phase. Athens, fighting with a desperation born of pure survival instinct, managed to hold on for another 9 agonizing years. They won some surprising victories at sea, but their resources were completely drained. Their empire was crumbling piece by piece, and the Spartan army was permanently camped at Decelia, choking the life out of Attica. The end finally came not in a great battle, but through exhaustion and one last, fatal mistake. The Athenian fleet was caught unprepared on a beach, at a place called Aegospotami, and destroyed. Without its navy, Athens could no longer import food. Starved into submission, the city surrendered. The long walls, the symbol of their power for generations, were torn down to the music of flutes. The great Peloponnesian War was over. So why, after more than 2,000 years, do we still read this story of a long-forgotten war? Why does the name Thucydides still command such deep respect? It's because he gave us far more than just a record of events. He gave us a profound and timeless meditation on power, war, and human nature. He wanted his book to be not just a story to be enjoyed for a moment, but a possession for all time. And in that goal he succeeded beyond measure. The first great lesson of this work is its unflinching realism about what actually drives human affairs. Thucydides saw that nations and people are moved by a powerful triad of motives: fear, honor, and interest. He brushed aside the noble speeches and religious justifications to show that, beneath it all, the pursuit of power and security is the real engine of history. The Melian dialogue is the most brutal expression of this truth, but the theme runs through the entire book like a thread. It's a sobering thought, but it's critical for understanding our world. When you watch nations compete today, when you hear leaders give their polished reasons for their actions, Thucydides teaches you to look deeper, to ask, what are their real fears? What are their actual interests? The second great lesson is about the psychology of power itself and the deadly danger of hubris. The story of Athens is a classic tragedy of overconfidence. Their stunning success against Persia and their subsequent rise to empire convinced them they were exceptional, that normal rules didn't apply to them. This belief led them straight to the disastrous Sicilian Expedition. They fell head over heels in love with a glorious idea and refused to listen to the cautious voice of reason. They confused their hopes with sound assessment of their actual capabilities. It's a warning that echoes powerfully down to our own time, a stark reminder that success can be more dangerous than failure, because it can blind us completely to our own limitations. Finally, Thucydides' history is a profound study of democracy and leadership in times of crisis. He shows us the real strength of a democracy like Athens, its energy, its creativity, its remarkable ability to bounce back from adversity. But he also shows us its fatal weaknesses, with brutal clarity, its vulnerability to smooth-talking demagogues, its tendency to make passionate, short-sighted decisions, and its cruel treatment of its best leaders. We see the sharp contrast between the wise, steady leadership of Pericles, who could guide and even contradict the people for their own good, and the reckless ambition of men like Cleon and Alcibiades, who pandered shamelessly to the crowd's worst instincts for their own glory. It's a powerful reminder that a democracy is only as strong and as wise as its citizens and the leaders they choose to follow. So, what can we actually take from this today? First, we can learn to be much more astute observers of the world around us. When you see a conflict brewing, whether it's between nations or in your own community, think carefully about the roles of fear, honor, and interest. Look for the underlying causes, not just the stated pretexts that sound good in press releases. Second, we can cultivate a healthy skepticism of overconfidence, both in our leaders and in ourselves. When a plan seems too good to be true, when it promises immense rewards with minimal risk, remember that Athenian fleet sailing confidently for Sicily. The wisest course is often the one that honestly acknowledges difficulties and prepares for them, not the one that ignores them in a fit of enthusiasm. And third, we can reflect seriously on the responsibilities of being a citizen. Thucydides shows us powerfully that words matter deeply, that debates have real consequences, and that the character of a nation is revealed most clearly in the choices it makes under pressure. That was the story told in the pages of History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. We've explored the main currents of this epic tale today, but I'll be completely honest with you. A summary can only skim the surface. The real power of this book lives in the details, in the weight of the speeches, and in the profound, often somber wisdom that Thucydides embeds throughout his narrative. This summary is meant to be a map to hidden treasure. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or resonated with you, I truly encourage you to seek out a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an education in power, politics, and the unchanging patterns of human behavior that shape our world to this very day. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this journey into the past valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that these stories matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another timeless book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning together.